Hello, my name is Micah Jensen, and I'm going to be presenting Lighting the Way, Ethical and Biblical Decision Making. Studying morals and ethical decision making through this class has been life impacting for me. I've learned a lot about myself and ways that I can make better ethical decisions to be more in line with God and His Word. The first thing to go over is what Bible verses that I think really present Christian ethics. The first one is Genesis 1:31. God saw all that He had made, and it was very good. I think this verse really highlights both that God created everything and that everything He created is good. And in this very dynamic and complex world, in order for everything to be good, there also has to be a good order. I think this verse really shows that God didn't only create the material things that we see around us, but He also created the order and the law that this world works on, and it was good. Secondly, Leviticus 2:26 states, "You are to be holy to me because I, the Lord, am holy." I think this verse really shows that morality comes from God's character. He is holy and has called us to be holy by following Him and being set apart. And it goes even further in Romans 12:2, stating, "Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind." This verse really just makes it very clear that the world is not always going to be on God's moral code, but rather some things are going to be against His will. But we're not to conform to that pattern, but rather seek God and be transformed by His Word and by His Holy Spirit in order for us to follow Him and be moral. I've also gained a lot of insight through the case studies that we did. The first one, precision on doing business with integrity through hard situations. Although I would say I've always believed in doing business with integrity, diving deep into this ethical dilemma that is something that could really happen to me in my current work was really insightful for me. It's so much easier to say do the right thing than it is to actually do the right thing when presented with an ethical dilemma. The case we studied was definitely one of those situations where it was hard to see what the right thing was because there were virtues on both sides. And I concluded, though, that although it's hard to lay people off, it's not actually more immoral to lay people off, but it's always immoral to cheat or do business without integrity, bribery, and things like that. So I think that I gained a lot of insight there, and if that case ever comes up, is to understand which values are more important to me than other values that could be there, like the value of compassion. I've also gained a lot of clarity on my view of artificial insemination by a donor. Being the product of artificial insemination by a donor, I was actually surprised that this was something that some people considered morally problematic. I've never really thought that through. So I really had to very thoughtfully dig into what the Bible said about family. And what I concluded is that a family doesn't require the same genetic material. There's not really any place that says that, but rather God's requirement of a family is that there is a husband and a wife, and the child is born into that, and that they are committed to each other and to raising the child in God's ways. Because that can be obtained by artificial insemination by a donor, as was in my life, I have concluded that artificial insemination by a donor is perfectly morally acceptable, and I now feel like I have a way to explain that to other people, as well as give advice on that if I ever had a friend who is considering that. I furthermore gained understanding on my stance for physician-assisted suicide. I did always believe that it was wrong, but I didn't really consider why it was wrong. And I'd not really, wouldn't been able to explain it very well to somebody. I still concluded, of course, that it's wrong because life is extremely valuable, and I do believe that God is in control of life and death, and that we do not have the say over the timing of that. But I also concluded that using the virtue of mercy and compassion, that we should medicate to keep the patient as comfortable as possible. With this clarity, I definitely feel much more equipped to explain my position based on all of the virtues that could be in this, in the argument of physician-assisted suicide. Another thing I learned was how to work through an ethical dilemma. And here's a case study that I have really gone through in my life in order to work to present how we could work through this. So the case study is that my sister has just found out that she's pregnant after being in a painful accident where she was administered pain medication without being asked if there was a possibility of her being pregnant. The medication that was administered has been linked to life-altering birth defects such as spina bifida, congenital heart defects, and more. The caring physician is recommending an abortion due to the possibility of these birth defects and is stating that they can administer the abortion right there in the hospital. My sister has mixed feelings on the morality of abortion and is devastated about the possibility of an accident causing an irreversible birth defect. She's asked for my advice. What do I tell her? The first step I would have to say is I need to gather the facts. I know she's pregnant and I know she was administered medication that has been linked to the birth defects, but I don't know what the likelihood of any of these birth defects are. I don't know how far along the pregnancy is and how that affects the likelihood of any birth defects. I also don't know how severe these birth defects are to the mortality and the quality of the life of the child. And I also don't know what responsibility the hospital has for not checking on the pregnancy before administering the medication. After I've determined the facts, I can move to step 2, determining the ethical issues that are involved here. In order to make in this case, the value of life and virtue of not taking an innocent life conflict with the consideration of the quality of life of a child with a birth defect and the responsibility to the mistake that was made that potentially caused this birth defect. After I've determined that, I can also move to step 3, determining the virtues and principles that have bearing in this case. In this case, the virtues are sanctity of life, the principle of against taking innocent life, compassion for the quality of the life of a child who may have a severe birth defect, and the family, and the unfairness and injustice of the family having to deal with a burden that was not their choice. After determining that, I can list and compare the different alternatives that my sister has in this case. Obviously, the alternative actions are to administer the abortion, to not administer the abortion now and do further testing to see if there are birth defects, not administer the abortion now and do further testing and not do an abortion later if there are, to not administer the abortion and hope for the best, and to not administer the abortion and seek legal counsel for the responsibility of the hospital to care for the child if it does have birth defects. After I've set out on those different alternatives, I can compare the alternatives to the virtues that I've listed out. Abortion in either of the 2 first alternative actions violates the sanctity of life and the principle of not taking innocent life. No abortion disrupts the quality of life for the child and is not maybe very compassionate for the quality of the life the child might have and the family, and it's unjust to ask the family to deal with a burden they didn't choose for themselves. Because there are the competing virtues, I would need to weight the virtues against themselves. In this case, I would weight the sanctity of life and principle of not taking innocent life above compassion and injustice of the unchosen. I would say that because the moral worth of human beings is absolute and eternal. Although the virtue of compassion and justice are certainly important and should be considered, they may be able to be applied to the case without having to violate the sanctity of life, which is unchanging regardless of the circumstances. So the next step would be to consider the consequences and make a decision. And due to the absolute and unchanging value of human life, the consequences in this case are of little value to the overall decision. In this case, I would advise my sister not to have the abortion regardless of the consequence of birth defects, because a human being with a defect or disease is not less of a person and their life is still very valuable. However, I would also advise my sister to seek legal counsel for the responsibility of the hospital to care for the child. It would be just and compassionate for all parties involved to seek the best care for the child, to make sure that they have the best quality of life possible in the case. This alternative satisfies both the most important virtues of value of life and not taking innocent life, but applies compassion and justice to the situation as well. Another area, an ethical dilemma where I'm actually undecided on, is gun control. I believe that we should have the right to own guns, but it is causing a lot of loss of innocent life due to mass murders and violent crimes in our society today. On either side of the debate, I see, and one of the reasons it's very hard for me to decide is that the sanctity of life is on both sides. And I can agree with both sides in how valuable life is and how guns can take life on both sides, whether we have guns or whether we don't. Due to my agreement that life is incredibly valuable and should be protected, I would need a lot more facts to make an ethical decision. I don't know what the statistics are around gun control, and I would need a lot more facts. I would also need a lot more facts to create better alternatives than just the black and white that we see a lot today of either guns or no guns. I think there's a lot of alternatives there that are not being considered, and I need to know all the facts in order to do that. In conclusion, ethical decision-making for the Christian should be based on God. That is my biggest takeaway from this. He's the creator of all things, and he's the ruler of all things, and all of those things he made for a purpose. So I think as a Christian, I want to understand the values and virtues that are in every decision, because those are the things that I can align with God. I can align my values with God's. And then I would need to seek God's wisdom through scripture and prayer to ensure that I am aligned with him and making wise decisions. Thank you for this class, and thank you for your time.